Welcome to Engage, a Genetec podcast. As consumers of technology, privacy is never far from our minds. And today, in the turmoil of a pandemic and large-scale social unrest, perhaps never more so.
Cutting-edge technologies changing the way police fight crime.
Nobody is listening to your telephone calls. That's not what this program's about. But I think it's important to recognize that you can't have 100% security and also then have 100% privacy.
In my world, when it's, say, privacy versus public safety, I can assure you it's never privacy that wins, nor should it be. But what I reject is the proposition that privacy must suffer.
In this, our maiden voyage episode of Engage, the Genetec podcast, we're turning the spotlight to the critical, often controversial topic of privacy, with two undisputed thought leaders on the subject. Author and former Privacy and Information Commissioner for Ontario, Dr. Anne Cavoukian.
And Genetec President and CEO Pierre Racz. To help us take the pulse on privacy and what's at stake amid the global disruption brought on by COVID-19.
And the aftermath following the killing of George Floyd.
I'm David Chauvin.
And I'm Kelly Lawitz. To kick off our first episode, First Principles, I asked Dr. Cavoukian to introduce us to the Privacy by Design framework and all that it hopes to achieve.
There are 7 foundational principles. The first one is essentially be proactive, address privacy protective measures up front before anything happens, bake it into the code, bake it into your data infrastructure so it becomes an essential component of what you're doing. The second, and perhaps one of the most important principles, was privacy as the default setting. The beauty of this is, unlike what generally happens without it, your customer is expected to wade through all the legalese and the terms of service and the lengthy pages of the privacy policy in search of the opt-out box that says, do not use my information for any purpose other than the intended primary purpose, which I'm consenting to. You know, life is short. Most people don't have the time to do that, but it doesn't mean that they don't care deeply about privacy. They care enormously. For the past 2 years, all of the public opinion polls, Pew Research, et cetera, have come in at the 90 percentile in terms of concern for privacy. 90% very concerned about their privacy. 92% concerned about loss of control over their personal information. Now, privacy as the default flips that on its head. It says to customers, you don't have to ask for privacy or search for an opt-out box. No. We give it to you automatically. It's the default setting. We are only permitted to use your information for the primary purpose that you consented to. Beyond that, we can't use it for any other purpose. If down the road a secondary use arises that we'd like to use it for, we have to come back to you and seek your positive consent. This is a game changer. Privacy is the default. It builds trust like no other. And companies who have done this and have gotten certified for privacy by design, they come to me and they've said, it's amazing the trusted business relationship we now have that didn't exist before. And also, when we go back to customers, and later on, if there's a secondary use that arises, they always say yes. They always give us their consent because they know the lengths we're going to protect their privacy and how much we respect it. So it really is a win-win, game changer. Privacy is the default. Then we have the vital need for security. People often approach security and privacy in a zero-sum manner. You can have one versus the other. You can only have a positive gain in one area, always at the loss of the other. This either-or win-lose model of zero-sum is so dated, and you should just throw it out the window. What I always say is, yes, while the term privacy subsumes a much broader set of protections than security alone, if you don't have a strong foundation of security from end to end with full lifecycle protection, in this day and age of daily hacks, you're not going to have any privacy. So make sure you have a very solid foundation of security, and encryption is huge. Make sure you build on encryption. visibility and trust. I'm going out of order, but I'm just talking about all these.
Okay.
It's very important that whatever information you collect from a customer, that they have access to it. I always tell people, look, you may have custody and control over someone's information, but it doesn't belong to you. It belongs to them, to the data subject. So make sure you give them a right of access to their information, make sure it's visible, etc. The beauty of this is, and again, companies have told me this, is they love it because it's the customers who point out if there are any mistakes. If you're a business, you're collecting thousands of pieces of information. You don't know what's accurate and what's not. The data subject knows exactly what's accurate and what's not. So it, again, makes it easier for businesses to operate. It enhances the quality of the information they have and the accuracy of that. So again, a win-win. I always say keep it user-centric. When you focus on the user, the customer, you will all gain. You show them the respect you have for their privacy, everybody wins, because once they understand that you respect their privacy, trust grows dramatically, quality of information grows dramatically, and these people you'll preserve their loyalty, but it will also attract new opportunities, friends and families and colleagues of these individuals. So you make it a win-win. Focus on privacy and shout it from the rooftops. If you're doing privacy by design, don't keep it to yourself. I always say, tell your customers the lengths you're going to protect their privacy. Just shout it from the rooftops. Tell your customers. They will respect it enormously, and you will both gain. See, it has to be a positive-sum win-win operation. That's the only way everybody wins. You win, the customer wins, you both benefit. That's what positive-sum is all about.
So we've been through two new normals. 2001, that was a new normal. And now we're in a new normal where it's forced many enterprises to adapt. They need to move fast or they die. And when I was thinking about that and reading your principles, I said, does that false dichotomy still hold? Is it still win-win? Can you release technologies really fast and try to bring some normalcy while maintaining privacy and security?
Absolutely. Because if you don't aim for win-win, your win-lose is going to turn into a lose-lose over time. You have to aim for a win-win, multiple positive gains. I'm not suggesting it's easy, but it's much better than the opposite. So right now, so you talked about 9/11. I was, I think it was my second term as privacy commissioner. I did 3 terms, and it was horrendous. Of course, I mean 9/11 was appalling. We got past 9/11, but what we didn't get past is after the tragedy was over, the surveillance, the massive surveillance measures that had been introduced during 9/11. They persisted. So in the United States, for example, you had the Patriot Act that was introduced. That has now just been renewed now. Again, warrantless surveillance. And you had the Department of Homeland Security and all kinds of very untransparent behavior, if you will. So what the measure that I try to bring, and let's apply it now to COVID-19. We're now under a pandemic which has enabled the emergency powers in privacy laws to be executed, meaning normally you couldn't do X, Y, or Z, but because of emergency powers, we'll be able to collect that data. That's the kind of thing that's happening. And I understand why. For public safety measures, people want to know who has what, etc. But there must be very firm sunset clauses with strong end dates, because the pandemic is going to end. What cannot continue past the end date is surveillance. And you see, privacy forms the foundation of our freedom. You cannot have free and open societies without a solid foundation of privacy. So don't tell me you're going to have to just, been there, we can't keep doing it. Yes, you can. If you want to live in a free society, you must preserve privacy. We can and we will do this. And that's what I've been, since the past 2 months, I've been doing media interviews every single day, usually 2 or 3 a day. The media call all the time because they're very interested. What's the effect of this on privacy? And I say, the effect does not have to be what you think it's going to be, that we're going to lose our privacy, over my dead body. There's no way we're going to give up all of our freedom and our privacy. We can and we must do both. And I'm happy to work with governments. Jane Philpott called me the other day. She's now working with Ontario Health. I'm happy to work with her. There are methods by which we can do this, but you have to start with the premise, yes, we can. We can have privacy and public safety, not one versus the other.
In many ways, I actually think us getting through this depends on privacy and trust, because until we have the vaccine,
yes,
we're probably going to have to use those contact tracing apps. Our workplaces are going to have to collect data on our health. They will have to share. And we won't be willing to share. I know I won't be willing to share if I don't trust that there won't be repercussions for me, that it's done in good faith and it's done with me, the individual, in mind.
There's so little trust. No one wants any of their information going to the government or their employer or business or whatever. Now, these contact tracing apps, if they don't have the trust of the public, no one's going to use them. And people are saying you need to have 50 to 60% of the population using them for them to have any effect. I'm sure there are other apps out there that do track everything. Singapore, China. I mean, do we really want to go that kind of surveillance model? That's what they're doing.
What could you tell organizations in terms of practically how to weigh the risks of either expediting technology and also not skipping the privacy and security aspects?
You see, technology, it moves at such a fast pace, as you know.
Exactly.
That the laws that we have in place, I mean, you create a new law and the technology is already 10 paces ahead of it. So the kind of laws we create have to have general guidance as opposed to specific, you must do this and this. For example, in the GDPR, when they included my privacy by design framework, we don't have it here in Canada. So our federal privacy commissioner, Daniel Therrien, went to the government 3 years ago and said, we have to upgrade our federal private sector legislation, PIPEDA. It was enacted in the early 2000s. It's dated. And look what they've done in Europe. They've included Anne Cavoukian's privacy by design, and she's one of ours. She's a Canadian. We have to add that to our privacy law. We have to make these changes. Now, have they done anything? No, despite Commissioner Therrien pressing them. One can only hope, but we have to keep pressing them to upgrade the laws. But in terms of tech, there's so much we can do at a tech level, and the big move now is towards decentralization. So when you have data all centralized in one honeypot, then that information can be used for a variety of purposes that were never intended. Hundreds of eyes can look at it that shouldn't be. It's a nightmare. When it's decentralized, then it goes under the control of the individual, the data subject. And you see, privacy is all about control, personal control over the use and disclosure of your information. If you want to give away your information, be my guest as long as you make the decision to do it. I always tell people, look, privacy is not a religion. Do whatever you want with your information as long as you are the one making the choice. And that's what decentralization supports. And now, increasingly, there's more and more coming out that supports that in terms of self-sovereign identity, protected identifiers. There's so much going on. So I'm very optimistic for the future, even though, people might shake their heads and say she's crazy. No, you never stop fighting for privacy and for freedom. I tweet every morning between 5:30 and 6 a.m. the latest stories of the day. A lot of them come from Europe. My husband is a saint. And I do this, and I have a large following. And invariably, one or two people will tweet back and say, lady, give it up. That ship has sailed. Privacy is dead. I say, are you kidding me? Get another friggin' ship. You don't just end things because it looks hard. The odds are against it. You figure out how to do it, and you move forward. And that's what technology can give us.
Foundational principles are so important.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. They've got to form the foundation, literally, of your operations. And when you bake it in the code, and that's why I talk to a lot of cryptographers, a lot of tech people, because then it becomes an essential part of what you're doing, seamlessly embedded throughout your operations. It's in the code. That's what we have to strive for. And we can do this. I've seen it done again and again. We have brilliant minds out there. We can do this. We have to keep our hope up. You can never give up. That's why I like to remind people, whenever these bad things happen in the privacy world and surveillance is on the rise and people's activities are being tracked, everyone gets understandably very depressed that, oh my God, they're chipping away at our privacy again and again. Yes, they may be doing so, but it's temporary. And our job is to keep it temporary. And you do that by spreading the word on how important privacy and freedom is. This is huge. I mean, this is what changes our life. You know, when I look at what's happening in China and Singapore with all the contact tracing, everybody's being traced and no freedom, I wouldn't want to live in a world like that, ever. Freedom allows you to decide how you want to live your life. I'm a big fan of Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple. And one of the things he used to do, it's hilarious, every 6 months less a day, he used to buy a new white Mercedes. He'd take his old white Mercedes, take it into the shop 6 months less a day, buy a new white Mercedes, same make and model, take it home, then bring it back 6 months less a day. Why? Because at that time in California, you had up to 6 months to get a license plate on your new vehicle. He didn't want a license plate number. He didn't want to be tracked. So he really believed in privacy. So unfortunately, after he died, they changed the law.
So I won't be changing my Yaris every 6 months. The government knows who I am. I want to take that same message that you're giving to consumers and citizens. The same applies to business, though, right?
For sure, and use it for your own good. Businesses, I keep telling them, this will give you a competitive advantage. It will develop trusted business relationships where presently there's such a trust deficit. So this will work for you as well as for your customers. It has to be doubly enabling win-win. And that's, if we can just spread that message across, that there will be multiple gains by using this, then people are much more inclined to do so. I speak to lots of boards of directors, and usually the first time I go in, they've got sour faces. They think I'm going to tell them not to use the information they have. And I say, give me 10 minutes. Let me tell you what Privacy by Design is about. Let me tell you how it's going to increase your business interests and give you a competitive advantage. And I walk them through, and then everything changes. They're in. They're telling me what they do. Can I do it this way? You just have to get the mindset across to them that this will work to your advantage as well as to your customers.
Dr. Ann Cavoukian, thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you.
On May 25th, we all witnessed George Floyd's senseless murder.
I'm marching for George, for Breonna, for Ahmaud, for Jacob, for Pamela Turner, for Michael Brown, Trayvon, and anybody else who lost their lives.
Although this initially sparked a series of global protests that were mainly focused on the topic of police brutality, specifically against Black Americans, we've seen it evolved into a wider call to re-examine law enforcement practices and law enforcement funding. Today's guest is Pierre Racz, CEO and President of Genetec. Pierre, thank you for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Dave. Nice to talk to you again.
Absolutely, always a pleasure. And I was curious, as a tech executive and as a thought leader yourself, how do you think technology, whether it's video surveillance and operational intelligence and some of the new upcoming emerging technologies, but how can technology continue to help cities and communities with their public safety objectives, considering the current climate that some would say a climate of distrust between a lot of communities and the law enforcement agencies, right? How can we avoid the label of Big Brother or the label of surveillance? And how can technology actually help public safety in a constructive way for all the communities that are out there?
Well, first of all, you have heard me talk for a long time about the fact that we're not Big Brother, we're Big Mother. And there's a fundamental difference between your big brother and your big mother. Your big brother, your brother is jealous of you, and when he tells you to go and fetch the ball that's in the road, he actually secretly wouldn't mind if a truck would knock you over. When your mother tells you don't go on the road, it's because she genuinely doesn't want harm to happen to you. And so the way we go about crafting our technology and the way we seek out our customers is our customers are big mother and not big brother. They genuinely are looking out for you. So do not confuse what is happening now as something that is normal or that we should consider normal. I think that it is. We let we let some governance loops remain a little bit open, and now we're renegotiating these governance loops, but that's perfectly fine. In a liberal society, and certainly we're trying to help build, or do our part in a liberal society, it is a big mother, not a big brother.
And do you think the industry in general has that same approach?
Well, those in the industry that actually spend the time reflecting on how their technology is being used and how they can make it easy to do the right thing and make it harder to do the wrong thing, yes, I think that is shared. I think that if we just go to fundamental principles, there is no one of our customers that would wish our society wind up like North Korea. And actually, the countries where the leaders think that, namely China and Russia, are places where we strategically do not work. We opportunistically work in those countries for Western companies, or liberal, I shouldn't say Western, but liberal democracy companies that try to work in those areas. We are not active in those countries for that specific reason.
And where do you draw that line of having your technology used in ways that you either do not condone or did not anticipate? Do you think it's your responsibility as a tech executive, or our responsibility as an industry, to ensure that citizens, whether it's citizens in a citywide surveillance context, or employees of a company in a private sector context, but do you think it's our responsibility to ensure that our customers can't breach people's privacy, or is it on our customers to make sure that they use the product appropriately? Where do you draw the line, and where do you hold that accountability?
Well, the technology is actually morally neutral. It's impossible if you're a hammer manufacturer to build a hammer where you can guarantee that none of your customers are going to whack someone with that hammer and cause them bodily harm. It's impossible to prevent people from repurposing the technology. But we can do things that will make it less likely to misuse our tools. Very rarely are we confronted with situations where we actually would be aware that the customers would be abusing the tools. But for example, we're in touch with Foreign Affairs Canada and with the State Department when we are dealing with customers that are outside of the G18, and we certainly have an open discussion with them to vet the customers to make sure that the technology is not used for purposes other than what they would want. Because again, it's hard for us to know how it's used, but they have access to intelligence that we don't have access to.
So hypothetically, you learn that, or Genetec learns that the system is deployed in an area that breaches basic human rights. The technology is used by a government that has complete disregard for human rights. What powers do you have to ensure that system can no longer be used that way?
Maybe I'll take a step backwards and talk a little bit about Henry Mintzberg, who had made these basically three classes of human organizational structures. The first is the government, and their main job are the three aspects, the three S's of security, which is military security, economic security, and social peace. Then you have the role of the companies. This fits in the plan for the government to create economic security, and a company supplies the materials and the products that society needs. And the third class of organizations is the communities, and their role is to comfort and console in times of joy, such as in entertainment industry and sports industry, and to console in times of grief, such as funerals. So that being said, we do our job by making tools that society needs, and these tools we make them in conformance with the social contract of the societies in which we operate. But the oversight of the behavior of other governments is not the job of the private sector, because we are really essentially powerless. If you just take the GDP ratio between Genetec and China, it must be close to $1 billion.
Fair enough. And so it's more on then the public sector to ensure that proper policies are put in place versus the private sector.
Well, the negotiating the social contract is part of, it's not so much the public sector, it is the combination of the elected officials and the people that elect them. And so right now we're seeing that the people are insisting, and that's perfectly legitimate, they're insisting about some of the ends that they want, and they want some governance around the means to which to achieve these ends. So everybody does want to have social peace. Very few people want there to be anarchy in the streets. But what we are discussing are what are the means that need to be employed to achieve that.
And, with that social contract, then, are you worried at all by the fact that in a lot of countries, the elected officials aren't as technologically literate as we would like them to be? And I'll quote Congressman Rocana, who's out of California's 17th district, who said earlier this year, and I quote, "It's embarrassing how technologically illiterate most members of Congress are." And all we have to do is look at when Mark Zuckerberg testified in front of Congress 2 years ago. Some of the questions that were asked to him were very surprising, right? And showed that a lot of these elected officials don't necessarily get the technology. And it's normal in a way because they don't come from the tech sector. They come from all sorts of walks of life. They're from different generations, different regional context. So we can't expect them to all be tech experts and privacy experts when it comes to technology. But what can the private sector do without engaging in massive lobbying effort? What can the private sector do to help educate our lawmakers and policymakers to ensure that they understand the challenges that are out there when it comes to privacy and technology?
Well, all right. First of all, one of the three pillars of liberal democracies is a representative government. And so if our government has smart people and less smart people, educated or scientifically literate people and less scientifically literate people, as long as it is representative of the population, that is perfectly normal. So don't be too hard on the politicians in the sense that, well, you should be hard on them. Don't be too nice to them. But if they are representative of the population, that's actually a good sign. One of the responsibilities that the people who know how the technology works is to help teach people. So I don't know if you've read Alan Alda's book, came out about 3 years ago. If I understood you, I wouldn't be making the face that I'm making. This book is illustrated very well by the George Bernard Shaw quote that the biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it actually occurred. Certainly as an engineer and a scientist, it is my job, among other things, to help explain the science behind the things that we're doing, because there is logic, there is reason behind the technology, and the more that people can understand it, the better they will be able to put it to use. Now, the people in government that actually understand it, it's incumbent upon them to help make sure that people are as educated as possible. And ultimately, the responsibility for education does fall on the government. Private sector can do a little bit, but the means that are at our disposal are not the same as those of the government.
So, earlier this week, Justin Trudeau, in kind of the same vein, Justin Trudeau mentioned that he wanted to push the concept of body-worn cameras with the RCMP, right, with the National Police. And again, that always brings up the same issue where you have those politicians that want to push either push technology or push a new type of policy around that technology without really understanding the potential issues of that technology, whether it's privacy, whether it's technological barriers. We saw the same thing with the 5G debate. So again, is it on industry thought leaders to take a position to advocate to the public sector what they should be looking at and what they should be concerned about?
Well, I think that, first of all, those questions are not at all technological questions. They're society questions. And maybe as an educator, what we have to do is give people mental tools with which they can clarify their thinking. So in terms of the body wearable camera, one mental tool that I find very useful is the 3 laws of robotics that were first written about by Isaac Asimov in the 1930s. Just to remind people who have forgotten, the first law is that a robot should not harm a human or cause harm to come to a human by inaction. Law number 2 is a robot should listen to all the orders given to it by a human, except if it violates the first law. And law number 3 is a robot should protect its existence unless it violates the first 2 laws. Now, Isaac Asimov's books were around exploring the paradoxes that ensue around these. For example, if a robot encounters a really evil person, can he kill it? And then, of course, that's certainly a whole series of books that he wrote about that. So the same thing, when we're talking about these body wearable cameras, we have to look at this from the perspective that a body wearable camera is basically a robot. It is not an anthropomorphic robot, as we mostly picture robots, but it's a square box, but it is a robot. And as such, it should be the robot of the person that is wearing that. Otherwise, what you're doing is you want to put political minders on your law enforcement or on people. And that, to me, having an electronic political minder that I have to wear all the time sort of smacks very much of North Korea. And certainly if we insist that be done to law enforcement, they could insist that the citizens also have to wear political minders. And that's certainly not somewhere where you want to go. So I think that we should think about this in the bigger picture is, what does it mean? How do we want to use our robots? So I think that the robots that we want, these body wearable cameras, on one hand, a society could mandate that the people to whom we give the responsibility of carrying around high-powered directed energy weapons, such as firearms, that comes with an accountability for their actions, and we can use body wearable camera to be accountable. But I think that the law enforcement officer, I want to have them, they're thinking human beings, and I want them to exercise judgment. And putting a political minder around their neck is assuming that they cannot exercise judgment on their own. I think that we should give them the right to be able to turn it off, or else they won't be able to do their job the way we would want them. So if they can't turn it off, they'll be unable to interview victims of sexual assault who would not want to be recorded. However, they need to be accountable for when they turn it off. So society can demand that if you turn it off, you have to explain why you turned it off. And if nothing happened during the period you turned it off, I mean, it's not a problem. But if something bad has happened while you turned it off, then you have just eroded the presumption of innocence that you might have had if you had it turned on. So I think that there are ways of using these devices, but we have to take a step back and think about what it really means to our society. It's not a technological question, it's a society question.
Last note, You've mentioned before you're thoughtful of how our society will be judged by society 200 years from now. How do you want to be remembered 200 years from now?
No one is going to judge me personally in the 23rd century because that'll be relatively irrelevant. And notwithstanding that we're a good bunch of people, Genetec also is going to be a small blip. But there could be many different types of futures. And I am certainly hopeful that the future that we're going to have is going to be the one that Gene Roddenberry envisioned, that is epitomized by his quote, in the future, there will be no hunger, there will be no greed, and all the children will know how to read. And so the last part is that people will know a lot of things, they'll have a lot of knowledge, and a lot of our social ills that we have today, in particular discrimination, is based on the lack of knowledge. People underestimate how much television actually reduced this lack of knowledge, and that discrimination, although not great today, was actually worse then. Not trying to minimize what it is today, but I'm trying to say 300 years from now, I'm confident that if the world doesn't turn into a place where we're governed according to the North Korean model, that will be the case, that just discrimination will be a bad idea from the past that we hadn't figured out as we were crawling out of the Stone Age. There is no place for that kind of behavior in the space age. For many reasons. One is that as we enter the space age, resources do become, especially in terms of energetic resources, they do become more abundant. So how they're going to judge us is if we were able to navigate our way towards this hopeful future, or if we took a bifurcation towards a totalitarian dystopia. To quote the old Leigh Hunt poem, Abu Ben Adam, I pray thee then, write me as one who loved his fellow men.
Very good. And so you believe that the focus on privacy and governance is a step in that right direction? Yes,
I believe that this invasion of privacy buys us very little and costs us very much.
Thank you very much for your time. This was an incredibly insightful conversation. Any last words?
I hope you invite me back.
Fantastic. So I was speaking with Pierre Racz, CEO and President of Genetec, Inc. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Engage, a Genetec podcast.
Engage, a Genetec podcast, is produced by Brendan Tully-Walsh. The executive producer is Tracy Aids. Sound design is provided by Vladislav Pronin, with production assistance from Carolyn Shaughnessy. Engage, a Genetec podcast, is a production of Genetec Incorporated. The views expressed by the guests are not necessarily those of Genetec, its partners, or customers. For more episodes, visit our website at www.genetec.com, on your favorite podcasting app, or ask your smart speaker.